I want to welcome everybody to tonight's presentation by Dr. Rick Meiners from his report, People Without Jobs and Jobs Without People. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that there will be French language translation for anybody who needs it. The translators will be near the microphone, so if anybody needs a translation either way, that's where you can find it. This evening was made possible by the generous sponsorship of Colleges Ontario, so we want to give a special thank you to Colleges Ontario. I'd also like to recognize our other sponsors for tonight's event: the Canadian Union of Public Employees, the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, and the Toronto Workforce Innovation Group. And they are also the publishers of Economy Out of Shape, Changing the Hourglass, and that report is on each of your tables as well. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of several ministries from the Government of Ontario, along with government representatives from across Canada and our Human Resources Skills Development Canada partners for tonight's evening. We're also joined tonight by leaders in the business, labor, the education, and the skills training community. So welcome one and all. The People Without Jobs and the Jobs Without People report really highlights the fundamental role that skills will need to play in the new knowledge economy, and the education and training programming that will need to be in place so that we have the mechanisms for developing the skills that we need. The Ontario Literacy Coalition recognizes this reality, and we're working collaboratively with our partners from business, labor, government, education, and literacy and essential skills community to seek viable solutions. We're pleased to acknowledge that a renewed workplace literacy initiative has opened up 14 new workplace literacy programs that will be providing the type of training that Dr. Meiners will describe tonight in his report, meeting potential students where they are and expanding the rethinking of how we need to meet the skills gap in this province. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tony Tilley, President of Sir Sandford Fleming College. Dr. Tilley is an educator with an extensive background in Ontario's colleges. At Fleming, President Tilley is leading the implementation of a strategic plan that focuses on excellence in student learning, superior services, environmental issues, and sustainability, as well as enrollment growth, community success, and human resources. Dr. Tilley is also the chair of the college's Committee of Presidents. He holds a PhD from York University, having completed his doctorate in English. I'd like to welcome Dr. Tilley to the stage.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening, and it is a pleasure for Colleges Ontario to have the opportunity to support your work. You know, I said an announcement a little while ago about some literacy funding, and I quoted Ludwig Wittgenstein, Austrian philosopher. Now, he wrote some very complicated treatises, very hard to penetrate. But he said something that's always stuck with me. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And I think, you know, that really captures some aspects of the work that you do, probing those limits, try to understand them, challenging them, looking for ways to extend those limits. And those limits exist in so many different ways for so many different people. So I congratulate you on the work that you're doing. It is great to know that there are 400 delegates attending this conference, and as I understand, from coast to coast. Ladies and gentlemen, here's the order of business for the evening. We are going to start with Rick's presentation in a few minutes, and then the way it's worded here is we're going to take a break for dinner. You'll be glad to know that. That'll be a little bit later on, though. But then we're going to return to the topic in a more interactive session with Dr. Miner and Mark Rivers, who will be introduced shortly. That's the opportunity to enter into some dialogue on this. So that's how we're going to structure this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Rick Miner. Now, Rick is a man who doesn't have a tie pin or a tie clip. He has a microphone attached to his tie. That's because he has been really traveling across the country, because the work that he has done on people without jobs, jobs without people, has really captured attention from every sector, from business, labor, education, government, and is triggering a lot of discussion and a lot of real engagement in what are the issues here and how can we move forward on this. Rick's background has included Bachelor of Arts in History, Master of Business Administration, and a doctorate in management. He has written books and papers on the subjects of management, organizational behavior, and he has spoken extensively in Canada and abroad on these and other topics. Rick is past chair of the Committee of Presidents, which he was a position he held when he was president of Seneca College. He has served on many boards, provincial boards, Ontario Innovation Trust, Polytechnics Canada, that's a national organization, the Toronto Regional Research Alliance, the Greater Toronto Marketing Alliance. So you can hear that there's a great breadth in this type of background. He's also a member of the Canadian Foundation for Innovation and the Millennium Scholarship Foundation, and has been actively involved with the Toronto Financial Services Alliance and the Transportation Advisory Committee of Metrolinx. So really quite eclectic in those commitments. Rick works closely with various federal government departments on issues that impact on immigration, skills shortage, innovation, and commercialization. Now, I've referenced the speaking that Rick has been doing on this report. Here are some of the venues. Canadian Club in February, Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, University of Waterloo, Sarnia-Lambton Workforce Development Board, the Chambers of Commerce in Timmins, Kitchener-Waterloo, and the Learning Partnership. He has spoken at a number of conferences, including that of the College Student Alliance, the Association of Canadian Community Colleges, and the Federal Liberal Party. In fact, speaking to the media last month, Liberal leader Michael Ignatieff quoted the report and its title directly. He told the Ottawa media that we think we're looking at a serious phenomenon, people without jobs and jobs without people. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to introduce our colleague, Dr. Rick Miner.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you as well, Leslie, and thank everyone in the group for inviting me tonight. I really look forward to this both presentation and interaction later in the evening. About a year ago, I had finished my term as president of Seneca College, and the new president had taken over, and the last thing he wanted me to do was hang around. So he was looking at a way to kind of outsource me. And Colleges Ontario, because I still had a contract for another 5-6 months or so, Colleges Ontario said, I tell you what, we'll give him a desk, we'll give him a computer, and we'll give him a phone and a Xerox machine if he'll come down and kind of look at some of the issues we're dealing with in terms of the labor force issues of the future. And I thought, oh, okay, that sounds all right. So I started going down, and initially it was going to be a pretty mundane little report because I was interested in primarily the demographics of the workforce and what was going to happen as a result of demographic shifts over time. And a lot of people have looked at that. In fact, you can go back into the 80s and find research projects that were done by the federal government, the Ministry of Finance, on the demographics that have pretty well paralleled exactly where we stand today. And then as I was reading, I started thinking more about the shift in the economy not only of Ontario, but Canada, North America, most of the developed world, for that matter, because we were moving from a labor to a knowledge economy. That was, you saw the offshoring of many lower skilled jobs. You saw manufacturing start to tank. And the reality became that we were going to have to move to a different type of economic model if we were going to be successful. So I thought that was pretty good. And then I thought, so what happens when they both happen at the same time? And that's what we're into right now. And what I discovered is nobody had looked at them happening at the same time. You could find people talking about the impact of the demographic shift. You could find people talking about the shift from a labor to a knowledge economy, but you couldn't find where people had put them together and said, well, what's the message when they happen together? So those are the two megatrends I'm going to talk about tonight. And the first one, let's start off with the demographic reality. The demographic reality is brought about because of World War II. The baby boomer, the mostly male armed forces, were in Europe for an extended period of time. In the US, they came back in 46. In Canada, they came back in 47. And the baby boom started. And for those of us who have been in Ontario for a while, you could track the impact of the baby boom from about the mid-50s on. In the 50s, we could not build elementary schools quick enough. Then we couldn't build high schools quick enough. By 67, Bill Davis created a whole new college system because that wave of people was coming through colleges. New universities were created. New campuses of universities were created. Well, those people start retiring on normal retirement in 2011. Some have retired early, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. But that has an impact. And why does it have an impact? Because you can see here what happens to the workforce as a result of the baby boomers. By the mid to late 60s, we were kind of at the low point in terms of the workforce that was 15 to 64. It grew until the 80s, and it plateaued for a while. Then you had what's called the echo, because the baby boomers' kids started to have kids. And then it boomed up again to about 2011, and then it drops through 2050. So the number of people that are in the traditional workforce after 2011 will drop for the next 40 years unless something happens. So what impact does this have on labor markets? Well, if the labor force participation rates were the same over age, it wouldn't have as big of an impact. But the reality is the labor force participation rates do change over time. You have your 15 to 24-year-olds. They have a lower labor force participation rate, and thank God they do, because they're in school somewhere. And that's what's driving down the labor force participation. It's highest through roughly the 25 to 55-year-old, and then it starts to drop. And by the time you have your 65 and older, you're about 10% labor force participation rate. Males are a little higher than females. And the female participation rate slightly lower than the male. And if you look at that figure over the last 30 years or so, it's pretty well the same. If you crank it back about 40 years, it's different because what happened is the female participation rate has increased significantly during the 60s and the 70s and has come up close to par to the male participation rate. In fact, that has been one of the major focuses of us having a healthy economy because there are more females in the labor force. This is the same information presented somewhat differently. Your red line, again, is your primary age group, 25 to 44. Again, those are the people who have highest levels of labor force participation. And your blue is those 65 and older. This is for Ontario. This is for Canada. If you looked at the same data for Ontario, it would be pretty well the same as that.